phone this week. We do have a number of absences, but we don't have anybody on the phone. First item is to approve the minutes. Well, first, is there someone a motion?
I will move the minutes.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Discussion?
I actually just made a couple of changes to for example, I inserted a comma at one point.
That's incredibly exciting
Got a name
news.
right, but
Co-Chairman Benka.
nothing substantive.
So,
Do you care that we adjourn at 7:58? We actually exceeded expectations.
that can be noted.
Thank you.
All right, all in favor?
Plug them in?
Any opposed?
Oh, it works.
You don't typically call for you don't typically call for abstentions, but I will since it was a voice vote. So Cliff, were you not there? Okay, so Cliff is abstaining. Melissa, is that okay?
Yep, got it.
Okay, good. Second order of business is the discussion of the capital work. Are we ready to?
Are we ready to
We're
go?
waiting. No, we're waiting for screen and laptop, so we just need.
So maybe what we can do is do a couple things. One is, does everybody,
You need the screen,
Anne or someone on demographics, do you want to give just a quick update about the MIT team and what kinds of things you've discussed with them? Can you turn on your microphone?
Yeah, we have three very talented and energetic young students from the Sloan School, and they gave us at the last meeting three options about how they thought they could move the process forward here. And the one that we worked on together that they have taken ownership on, and Alberto loves it because they can do it kind of on their own. I think Sergio called it subcontracting to them. And what they are what they are attempting is a predictive model for kindergarten enrollment. And so they're working on, which again, Sergio says if we get that, then that will be a miracle. So they're going to present, they would like to present, and I'm trying to run that by Susan and Richard this evening, but we would like to present, they will do the presentation of their own work on May 7th. They're graded on May 15th at the Sloan School, so they would like to get your feedback and criticism before they present for their grade. But that's what they're looking to do, and they're taking a look at some of the data or all of the data that we've gone over, and they're going to try to put in some of the qualitative indicators, maybe even some that they come up with, and some others. And we dealt with our first regressive model tonight. Regression, I know.
Are they including in their like real estate trends and people, smaller spaces,
Yes,
all
absolutely, absolutely. And Alberto has been working on that. The housing piece is huge, so they're.
What might be really nice is if they could give us a list of the hypotheses that they're testing, because Sergio, you've talked to them about, you all have talked to them about all the hypotheses that have been generated, so maybe they could just provide that so we know what they're doing.
We had a sort of a brainstorming session with them this afternoon and talked about various possible things to look at. So I think come back to us next time we can answer that.
Great.
Yeah, I don't think we can share what our hypotheses were, including housing stock, Lisa, and Jed Fehrenbach has been fabulous with that, and Alberto has been working with that. We'll come out with some pieces on that. But that's the whole idea, Susan, for them to come up, kind of think out of the box from where we are and come up with some other hypotheses. But they're going to be coming to meetings regularly, at least one of them, one of the triumvirate, and so we're moving that. Feels good. It feels good to have some new blood and to watch my colleague Sergio teaching these young people. It's a different tone of voice on the committee and Lee, so it's good. Feels good. We're happy to have them.
I think even more, perhaps, without wishing to promise too much or to oversell, their goal is really quite ambitious, and that would be to leave the town and the schools with a model which is predictive and which can be used by entering data which the town and the schools can acquire each year, and that the prediction is actually 5 years forward.
Great.
So if, when I said it would be a miracle, I meant it.
All right, great. The only other update is, I don't know if we've told the group about April 2nd.
I believe we have not.
So one of the questions that this group has asked itself, and Dick and I are starting to get as an external question, is given the March 1st deadline is no longer applicable, to what extent does the rest of the town need to kind of get an update of some sort on the work of the committee? And since town meeting is coming up at the end of May, and we're clearly in the middle of budget process season now, the selectmen had a very brief update before the public hearing, I think. The school committee has asked for a comprehensive update, and the advisory committee has asked for an update. So the advisory committee update will be on April 2nd. Certainly, so Dick and I will be presenting something that will be brilliant and genius that we haven't written yet. And in fact, we might not write. You all might write. But the coach, it would be really nice if the chairs of each of the subcommittees could attend, because if there are questions, clearly, we can't answer questions on your work. So, or we could, but it would be better if you were there.
And we'll get the dates out to everybody.
Right. But it's April 2nd.
April 2nd is a Wednesday.
So Wednesday.
It would be
It would take the place of this one. So,
That was the thinking. Yeah.
right, that's the idea.
Can I just make one?
Yeah.
And I think this has come up, but for me and others in the past, I think it is really helpful for us to be working off of a calendar. And so as we talk to other folks about what we're doing, if we're not talking about when we're doing it, I think it loses context for me. So I would really strongly suggest, if we're not talking about how our work looks and sort of scheduling that out as part of that discussion, I think that's a very incomplete way of talking about what we're doing.
Right.
And I think so I would just strongly urge us to continue to keep that.
Yep.
And me, I'm prepared to say it every meeting until we see it. So
Good.
thank you.
I have a related question, which is, you mentioned the school committee, the advisory committee, and the board of selectmen. Are you thinking that those are separate? Because it would seem to me that it would be highly advantageous to put the folks in one room and to hear the same information once from the same people.
Certainly, everyone is invited, but I do think that given the nature of some of these meetings, that different groups are going to want to ask different sets of questions. So it would be terrific if we could just do it once, but the problem is that different groups are going to want to ask their questions. So unless we had a joint session of everyone, which we could do. I mean, school committee doesn't typically meet on Wednesday nights, nor does selectmen, but we could certainly invite them.
Neither does the advisory.
Right. No, I think we can invite. I don't believe that the selectmen have asked for another presentation.
Great. Tick, tick.
So, but I think it's a great idea just to invite everybody to this.
Yeah, and I actually would reinforce the idea that the fact that folks are going to ask questions, which is exactly what we would wish, it's entirely appropriate that different boards and bodies hear the questions from different boards and bodies.
Absolutely, but I think part of the question also is which we have not yet addressed, is anything that's more open to the public than that as a Q&A. Because right now, April 2nd is for advisory committee members to ask questions. If we were to, anyway, we can think about format, because I think that there right now isn't a format for the general public to ask those questions.
Okay.
Susan, is there any way that we could, on the on the town website or forever, that we could ask the public to submit questions?
We could. I mean, they tend to. We've gotten a fairly.
But I mean, in a more formal way, so that at a certain point in the presentation, we'd say these are the questions we've received from the public, and then make an attempt to answer them. Several of them, I'm sure, many of them will be the same question, but.
Well, it's a good question. Well, we'll think we'll think a little bit more about the public aspect of the format.
Okay. Item number 2 is the report from the Capital Subcommittee.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? I have the mic, but
Is that mic on, Lisa?
it is on. I want to hold it up. Okay. All right. So this is our, tonight we're going to take the opportunity to give you an update as to where our committee is. We've had a lot of meetings, and we have, other than the some work that we've done with relative to the policy questions being explored by other committees. We haven't shared with this committee yet our work in detail. So primarily our goal tonight is to share with you what we've done, what our way of thinking about the question at hand, the goals of our subcommittee, how we've defined it, and then share with you the data that we've collected so that we're all sort of working off the same information. And so I think tonight we'd welcome your comments and questions and input. I want to just, before I dive into it and show the first chart, I want to be very clear that all of the data in here, this is a very, it's a moving target. Data is improved every day, and changes every day, literally in some cases. And so we had to put a stop at a moment in time and do our analysis based on that. And then some things, is just imperfect information that we had to make some assumptions about. And so we've done that here. And it's really for planning purposes, for order of magnitude discussion about recommendations that we can make at the end of this process. So Sergio and Tim are here, and this is quite detailed, so they will jump in and say anything that I neglect to say and provide additional color. So I'll jump in. So our subcommittee's purpose, just to be clear, because there have been a lot of iterations of looking at the capital problem. And so, we are in the context of the Override Study Committee, which is identifying, capital costs and then making recommendations about ways to do things more efficiently from a financial perspective. We're not really charged with looking at pedagogical issues related to expansion, that sort of thing. So our subcommittee's purpose, as we saw it, was really to test the expand in place capital costs. So the recommendations that have been out there from the B-Space and from the school committee, and just test those and make sure we were comfortable with those, and for this group to be able to use those as a planning tool as we discuss overrides and debt exclusions, et cetera. So that was our first purpose. Secondly, to be able to daylight the capital and cost implications of policy choices. So, some of those policy choices are related to some of the things that we've talked about in this committee, having to do with, programs like that contribute to population, like Metco and materials fee, things like class size. But then it's also related to, choices about having a K-8 model, choices, those type of things. So we've tried to evaluate, really, I don't know if you remember the very first chart that we saw in our very first meeting about all of the values of the Brookline schools. It's those type of things, not just the ones this committee's looking at. And then lastly, if there's anything that hasn't been explored that people wanted explored that we felt in our study led us to something that hadn't been explored, to try to explore that further and identify a cost associated with that. So this is a little bit of history of how schools have changed over time, and this is where you can see that in the schools that we have, the classrooms from FY08 to FY14 have increased from 205 classrooms to 247 classrooms with the infrastructure that we have. And we just think this is an important thing to note that, in that time there were some, Runkle was expanded and Heath was expanded, but so we've been able to capture additional classrooms that way, but that there has been a lot of growth in the existing context. And then this is perspective moving forward. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but this is how we see through the expand in place how the schools get to go from a 4-section to a 5-section, for example, at devotion. So anyway, we may go back to this one. Tim, I don't know if there's anything else to add on this one, or these two.
I would say this is really just trying to highlight what the interim space needs are, and using sort of the most easy to recognize numbers around classroom growth. So, for example, you'll see 4 at Lawrence, which is kind of consistent with the 4 Lawrence mods. There actually is some, we think, a little other capacity that's probably available that's not included in here. So this sort of shows a net need, which I think, depending on your view of a bunch of other things, probably goes away based on, I shouldn't say probably, does go away based on the build-out with the expanded place.
This basically assumes status quo with regard to existing practices. I mean, this.
Yes, it does. Yep.
Okay. I mean, this shows,
sorry.
if you go back to that shows Driscoll going from 26 to 38 and so, or whatever the numbers were. Yeah, 20.
So is this based on the schools department's projection of the additional 630 kindergarten every year?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm just not quite sure I understand the table. The row needed / OLS.
Sorry, so if you go, the best way to think about this, look at the total. The total will reflect the numbers that Peter Rowe presented in November.
Okay.
Right, so that's your reference point there. FY14 goes back to the 247 from the prior and is the actual as we sit here. And so what we've basically done is then created, in my mind, the things that people would expect. 4 classrooms at Lawrence, 5 classrooms at Devotion. I will say that's a little more nuanced than that because while Devotion goes to 45, this is not a Devotion parent calling me right now. It's my mother. Well, Devotion goes to 45. Actually, it's really built as a 4-section school, so there's really sort of 9 classrooms added. So you can sort of think of that as being 5 additional and 4 suboptimal. And the other piece here is the Driscoll expansion. So that's basically the new classrooms that come online. The needed OLS is the math.
It's the plug.
It's the plug.
So like just to make sure, if I look at FY18 to FY19, their total need goes up by 1, the needed goes down by 4, and that's because Devotion goes up from 40 to 45.
Right, and we have a
Yes.
more nuanced chart that
Yes.
shows
Yes.
that we're working from.
No, that's great. I just wanted to make sure I understood. So basically, that you can think of that as being the shortfall
That's right.
compared to the roadmap for growth of the various schools.
That's exactly right.
So, so this is sort of taking that point and drilling down a little further into it. So this is the numbers that we've all seen from Peter that we got in November. The increase in students and the corresponding increase in classrooms that will be needed to serve those students, and again, without any policy changes. And we've shown this before in the context of policy conversation. And what this shows is that there's a sort of a cumulative demand because we're not adding, well, this is before adding anything. And then there's also this issue of suboptimal space demand, which is important to remember because this is the school committee in their vote noted that there is additional suboptimal spaces. And these are spaces that we can talk more about if you like, but spaces that are underneath stairs for particular, they're just not perfect classrooms, things that you would not, but they're workable. They're not anything. They've been classrooms. They're acceptable classrooms. Some of them are found to be charming, but they're not classrooms that you would want. But you might not build just for them. But if you are building, you may want to address them because you don't get from that first number of 205 classrooms to the 247 without really carving up schools and carving up classrooms. So that's sort of the state of the suboptimals. So we've added that into the mix.
Lisa, before you go on, can you go back to, I just wanted to pick up on the point that Chad reminded me of, that in looking at the old Lincoln School line, I think it would be helpful for all of us to help the community with this in the following way. There is confusion between the use of Old Lincoln as a space necessary to help with the phasing related to construction projects, so that some Devotion students, for example, would be likely to move off-site during the construction phase to make the project possible. But independent of that, the school is also performing a function of picking up enrollment demand, which cannot yet be met until the Devotion, Lawrence, and Driscoll projects were to come online.
We call that swing space versus overflow. Those are the 2 ways we call it.
That's fine, but I'm not sure that everyone's understood that. So Old Lincoln is playing a dual role in this period out until roughly 18 or 19. Thank you.
So this chart, I want to also be really clear on this chart because actually this one might come out because this isn't, it's kind of confused because it's not what we're recommending or even what we're using for our baseline. It's just kind of, it just kind of gives you a perspective of things that are changing. But I think, I don't know, we'll have to talk about
Actually, and one thing we think might be useful from the committee is a chart taking a shot at where are classrooms available in the interim and then in the final, something that's useful. Because we've looked at this a bunch of different ways, assuming devotion relocation to, one of the things we looked at is there capacity at Lincoln to deal with, various scenarios during construction and the like. So I personally found it helpful just to sort of see where the classrooms are and when they're available and when they're needed this way. But if people don't, then we probably wouldn't want to include this in the final.
All right. So anyway, so back to the baseline demands. We just discussed that. So we looked at the working plan, which is, these are the projects that are underway and sort of substantially underway, and that is BEEPs are transitioning out of the K-8 schools and into lease space. So that's something that's happening. There are still 6 BEEP classrooms and in the schools, but half of those at least are being transitioned out. So that's something we looked at. Lawrence is the second one that we looked at. There is an imminent need for Lawrence. They're sort of bursting at the seams. They've identified a way to add 4 classrooms to their existing building. It's gone through a couple of iterations. It was going to be modular, and now it's probably going back to a more traditional construction. It'll probably be more costly due to aesthetic concerns by neighbors, et cetera. But the bid process is underway, and that will continue to move forward. On Devotion, this is the project that we know is in design, and there is a building committee in place to oversee this one. I think Devotion was the next in line to be renovated, and it's going on its course. The renovation is needed. Most people agree with that's needed, and there is community support for it. So this is sort of this is a project that is down, as we said in our interim report. This the train has kind of left the station on this one, and I think that we've captured it as something that is going to happen in our numbers. Because what we tried to do was say, okay, the things that are going to happen, how does that reduce that need? And then what's the remaining need? So that was sort of our way of looking at this. So we've captured Devotion in the plan that's going to happen. Others may have other opinions on that, but that's what we've done to show this. I don't know if Sergio or Tim want to opine on that. Okay. So Old Lincoln School, again, is another piece. It doesn't add permanent classrooms as opposed to the other 3, which could add permanent classrooms. But they have the schools have hired an architect to plan a $3.5 million renovation for the fall of 2015, which would be for, Susan, what did you call it?
Well, swing space is for construction.
Right. So what's the other one?
Overflow is
for overflow. So it's really for swing and for overflow. It's for the kids that need to be in there during this time period, whether it's for Devotion, capital work, or whether it's for overflow because there's nowhere else to put them.
Actually, chances are that in 15 it probably is just overflow, not swing, because there's no construction yet started.
So, yep.
Would the overflow be from all of the different schools, or just what you're not going to be able to squeeze any more into Devotion?
So I think the way that the superintendent has laid it out thus far is that it's conceived and will planned to be for upper grades, sort of 7th and 8th. And the reason that decision needed to occur was because the capital improvements need to address lab space and the things that 7th and 8th graders need. And I think there was probably also educational reasons for making that decision. But I think, and anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, I think at the current moment, it's unclear which schools that would come from, and it's based on a variety of needs, and not the least of which is a decision about Devotion. At the moment, there are 3 potential options, design options for Devotion that have varying levels of need for students to relocate for various portions of time. So depending on, and that's expected to become resolved in early fall, and that will change the understanding of who needs to be relocated. Yep.
just if you go back to the chart that you thought you might take out, it showed 3 needed at OLS during fiscal year 15.
I would say that's just a plot. So again,
Yeah,
think of that column as math. So the reality is, if you look at the way I understand this, Runkle's at 26 and could be at 27. Heath is at 25 and could be at 27. There are little pockets of capacity where in next year there is classroom availability, is my understanding.
So I guess the question is for overflow purposes, is Lincoln School going to be, the old Lincoln School, going to be needed in fiscal 15, in the 14 to 15 school year?
It's planned, but I don't think it's coming on until fall of, I don't.
Fall of 15.
So that's fiscal 16,
okay.
Right?
All right. So
it's, yeah. So I don't think it's
so
needed,
there's
nor is
no.
it online.
So in
right.
fact, yeah.
No,
Okay.
but the point is, what Tim is saying is FY15 is the fall of 14.
I understand.
Okay.
I understand. I mean, this that.
It's needed slash old Lincoln, right? It doesn't have to be old Lincoln.
I mean, that
Correct,
that
yes.
3 is going to be met with
Yes.
other
Correct.
in other ways.
They're going to figure out
This
somewhere
fall.
to put them. Yep.
Right.
Yeah, really, it probably should just say, from what you described, it should probably just say needed, and OLS is sort of the bracket if that's where some of the later stuff will come. But wherever it comes from, that's what's.
You know, I will be very honest and say that we put this one in because this was helpful to our subcommittee because we've been living with this chart and
Yeah.
it's been moving over the past 5 months. But it probably isn't. It's actually probably confusing.
And indeed, just looking at it, this one shows 4 classrooms coming online at Lawrence in the next school year,
Right.
which is not going to happen.
Right. So
So
this one, so our later ones will be clear as to our current thinking.
you just wanted a chart that would trigger a lot of
And
questions.
we found it useful. But
And there,
No,
there's
and it really is.
one other confusion I think we need to get straight. When we say FY15, what school year is that?
14, September 14 to June 15.
So everyone needs to understand that there's this lag essentially that's tied into the way these charts are put together.
So just so that people can hear that.
Right, so in these charts, again, the ones that are more clarifying, for this purpose, we have tried to make that distinction so that everybody can keep track.
Why don't we just footnote it on the capital charts? Because the capital ones are particularly confusing. For whatever reason, people aren't confused about the operating ones. So maybe just in future
Okay.
capital charts,
You're
when
right.
you use FY15 the first time you do it, say,
Yeah.
no, FY15 means September 14
Okay, so,
June 15.
to June of 15.
so, well.
It is
actually-
school year, yeah.
FY equals graduation year.
Okay, keep
Okay, so, so where were we? We were.
We were
All right,
micromanaging your
so
slides.
we were here in the classroom demand, okay, so this was Peter's information plus the suboptimals. We talked about what are the projects that we felt are going to help alleviate this demand that are already in process, and we included devotion in that. People could disagree. And so if you assume that you would, oh shoot, that's not what I wanted to do. Where's the pointer on this thing? All right. So if you assumed, beeps, again, we put this in at 6 because there are 6 beeps that are currently housed in K-8. There's a Lawrence addition of 4 classrooms, and the devotion rebuilding gets you 5 new classrooms, but as we'll show, it also helps alleviate your suboptimal space by adding 4 to 5 additional classrooms that are going to help take out some of the suboptimals in devotion and put them in spaces that one would want classrooms to be in, because devotion's been particularly squeezed. So what you can see here, and if I can figure out, does anybody know how to work this pointer? It is. It's working. I just don't know where the pointer button is. Yeah. This one? I thought I did that one. Oh, okay. So what we're looking at here is 6. So we had this demand down here, the cumulative baseline demand, which got us up to a need for 20 in 15. And the way we're starting to address that is through the beeps. There are 6. Lawrence modules will add 4 classrooms. Devotion rebuilding will add 5 classrooms. So that starts to take down your remaining need to a place where you only need you're only short 1 classroom in 15 and 16. You're short 6 in 17, but but then once, and 9 in 18, so this is why you need to use Old Lincoln as a swing space or as an overflow space, but when Devotion comes online, you're back down to 5. Devotion also addresses, we were using the number of 12 for suboptimal demand, suboptimal spaces. Devotion addresses that with 8. So what you end up at 18 with these projects, so not yet a Driscoll or any of the other options, is a need for 5 classrooms with suboptimal demand of 8. So that's just sort of the working, okay, how do we solve this problem?
And during this time frame, BEEP doesn't come back into the schools.
Correct. I mean, BEEP, and that's a policy choice, right? I mean, that's one of those things that we were talking about, do you overbuild so that you can bring BEEPs back? I mean, that's a question, right? So the one thing I do want to note is that we found out today that this number of 6 is actually 3, that there are BEEPs at Heath, Runkle, and Driscoll, and there are 6 of them in total, and that 1 is going to stay in each school. So that means that we had thought we had heard before, that all 6 were going to transition out to lease space, but that's not accurate. So this number 6 will go to 3, which means this remaining need will go to 8. So we'll have a need of 8 and then a suboptimal space of 8. So,
Lisa, can I just ask, why are the 3 remaining at the schools?
So to the best of our understanding, and again, we understood this late today, is because there are some special needs and transportation issues in some of those schools. So at Heath and Runkle, they were built specifically to address the needs they have. I said Heath and Runkle, right? At Driscoll, there is a high demand classroom or a high intensity classroom, and that I think the desire is to have that one stay at Driscoll. So I don't know if it could be moved out. We don't know so that's something to talk about. But there is, and again, this is why these numbers are for it's for planning purposes for order of magnitude. So we just want to kind of show you our thinking. These will adjust. Although I think that one is better information. But again, we could make a recommendation that they move out, or we could make a recommendation that they come back. There are things we can do. Yes.
You said where the other 3 were going, and I didn't hear. Where are they going?
To leased space.
Leased space.
So most of the BEEPs have been transitioned out and are in space that's being leased in temples around town and other locations.
So they were, and that is on the recommendation of the superintendent?
I think that has occurred because there's just no other, if your priority is K to 8 in the spaces that we have, you've had to move something out in order to have those as regular classes as you go from,
Justification to extend our expenses to early childhood, especially with special needs, was to reach out to families in order to incorporate them early into the public school support system. So that to make them isolated nursery school programs is not part of the thinking of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation 40 years ago, and the best extension of public
Say one
schools.
quick thing?
I don't want to have these discussions.
I don't want to have this discussion now.
That's not what BEEP is about.
Right, just so we're clear, so the ideal vision would be a pre-K to 8 vision. If you couldn't have a pre-K to 8 vision, you wanted early childhood centers where you would cluster pre-Ks together so that you had a critical mass. You don't want a classroom here, a classroom there, a classroom there. So I think this is supposed to be about capital and not about the pedagogical.
But also, just so everyone's clear.
Do you have a mic?
The Robert Wood Johnson experiment 40 years ago has nothing to do with BEEP and the way it is run and its focus today. So that is not, it's just not, it hasn't been for a long time.
So one of the things that we noted that the other subcommittees had done was put these issues sort of on the table for thinking and get the data out there. And really that's what we're trying to do, get you to understand sort of how we think about this and the data. Even if the data isn't perfect today, it's just, kind of gives you order of magnitude, because I think it is those policy conversations that we're going to have later that really nail down our recommendations. All right, so that's where we are in terms of as we move forward with BEEPs, the Lawrence modulars, and the Devotion rebuilding, we end up with somewhere between 5 and 8 remaining classrooms needed, plus 8 suboptimals to some degree. So the baseline demand considerations, a lot of these I've touched on, but I just want to be clear that, homerooms and classroom sections are somewhat definable, right? You are a 3-section school, you're a 4-section school, you're a 5-section school. If you know how many students are in a cohort and you divide them by students per classroom, you can get to how many classrooms you need. But there is less certainty about that in the long term because we don't know, although maybe the MIT students will shed light on this and will be clearer. That's the hope. So I just want to make that clear. That's actually the most definable piece. The stuff that isn't as definable is the suboptimal spaces. It's anecdotal. There's varying degrees of suboptimal spaces across the system. What I may find suboptimal may be different from what Peter would define as suboptimal. So I believe that he is giving a presentation to school committee tomorrow with some pictures of the ones that pretty much everybody agrees are suboptimal, and what helps and has informed using 12 as a working number for planning purposes. We've really dug into that with Peter and tried to understand what those spaces are, and we feel comfortable with that as a working number. But you could say that number was 24, you could say it was 3. And then the beeps. Again, this is that there are currently beeps at these 3 schools, and if one stays, so we already talked about that. Does any of my colleagues want to chime in?
I'll just say on the suboptimals, it is, I think, subjective. We have not, given the growth of classrooms, I think our view is there's high likelihood there's going to be things that people view as suboptimal. We've not done any per se diligence of them themselves. So I think we put it out there. We've used the 11 to 13 that the school committee gave us as a given. So that's something we'll spend a little more time on really understanding that better visually. But
and just so you know, the school committee didn't do due diligence on 11 to 13. That was Charlie and Peter's number. So
we had some conversation with Peter about that, and with some examples with him and Helen, who's the chair of the capital subcommittee of the school committee, and I think it feels clear that there are that this is a good working number because it was defensible in their eyes. All right, so we've done some cost information, and everybody will have a copy of this, and we can kind of figure out how this plays into our recommendations as a full committee about overrides and debt exclusions. But the Lawrence addition is estimated at $4 million. I know at the moment the hope is it's lower than that, but we round it up to be 4. And the Devotion rebuilding currently stands at $110 million as its total cost. And the important thing to note here is MSBA participation, which is, the MSBA will fund some portion of projects that, if they have a component of new classrooms, new space, and if they meet the MSBA standards for funding and for classroom size and that sort of thing. So, the Lawrence addition does not qualify, both because we need it quickly and it's a low number and it's probably not worth. I'm not sure why the decision was made not to do that, but it just doesn't seem to qualify anyway. So the town share of that, which is what you see on the right-hand column, is $4 million. For Devotion, the expectation, and right now we are in the MSBA process. We've filed a statement of intent, and we're going through the feasibility, and this is sort of marching along. The expectation from everything that we've heard from schools, the town, and HMFH is that they'll fund somewhere around 35%, which leaves the town share at $81 million.
Yep. So those columns don't add?
There's a $2 million error in both columns.
Yeah, you're right.
Believe me, that's a rounding error.
We were going to suggest that.
I just wanted to clarify for a moment about Lawrence. Lawrence was never submitted to the MSBA. It might have been eligible, it might not have been. But the concept was that it was space that the superintendent realized he needed on short notice, perhaps a little missing on the planning. But the result was that they went and got advice from the building commission to go modular for that specific reason, with the thought that the modular would be a quick delivery. And I think you also understand that when you work with the MSBA, it's not only that they impose their own standards, but they have their own time schedules. And so a decision was made early on as to why Lawrence would not go through that. And monies were appropriated through town meeting for the purpose of building the Lawrence project.
The thing that is missing on this chart is capitalizing BEEP at the leases. And actually, that is exactly why there's a $2 million off here, because we took that off and we didn't change the total. This morning we took that off. So for BEEP, we decided to address this verbally as opposed to trying to capitalize it because it is lease costs. But we did look at these leases, and we have come to the conclusion, which I think others have looked at them as well on other committees, that the rental costs are reasonable, that if capacity there, it makes sense to co-locate in K-8, but from a cost perspective, if we don't have room in K-8, the leases are a cost-effective way of obtaining BEEP space. And they've also been constructed fairly flexibly. So we may decide, depending on when we think space will come online, one might want to lock in space for longer. But the truth is, the way that these have been structured to meet the changes in needs over time it's been well executed. So we feel okay about that. Anybody else on BEEP? Go ahead.
As the chair of the revenue subcommittee, can we make sure that we can make sure that these temples or whatever we're renting from pay pilots? Or would they?
Do religious organizations pay pilots?
Yes, some do.
Anyone can pay a pilot. It's all voluntary.
But I think it would be, there's a cost savings associated if they actually pay pilots.
That's a good recommendation for your group.
They're probably just going to, increase the rent to cover it, though. I mean, the taxes are a pass-through in leases generally.
Can we ask them to pay more pilot?
We solved the problem.
And then the fees go up.
Since you introduced the statements about the leases being cost-effective and well-constructed, the point is that they're constructed in 3-year terms. So we're committed for 3 years, after which we can either renew for 3 or we can leave. And that, I think, was the real point here that seemed to make a lot of sense.
What about the group services that are required, such as a nurse or how does that work? We're public schools, so we have some responsibility for the BEEP program. What kind of liability do we take? What about the psychologist, the interviewing, all those pieces? Is that factored in any kind of cost issue? Someone has to go out and talk to the families, talk to the kids.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
Yes.
It's not a capital issue.
Right.
And it's not a capital issue. So it comes in under program, under operating?
That's a good question, because I don't think the school's operating committee is looking at that.
Well, I mean, the nurses, that's why you cluster the BEEPs, right? You cluster them so that you can have, a nurse there a little bit at a time or whatever it is, and that's the point of clustering them.
Right. But if we're looking at cost, that's a cost that is more expensive than if we had anything. That's all. Just maybe. I'm not sure that's right.
But I think that the observation that we had on the capital subcommittee was we asked ourselves, if you instead opted not to rent, but to build those classrooms, then the capital costs and the debt service associated with that is 10 times or more the actual rental cost. So if the rents continued for 30 years, then it probably would no longer make sense. But for a reasonably long period of time, the savings are very significant compared to a cost avoidance of not having to build a rather large number of classrooms.
I think that, Sergio, that's actually a point we should flesh out, the way that you've made that with the lease numbers and all of that. I think we can show that, because it does show, is there a point at which you will wish you had space or not, So we'll do that. So the way that our committee approached this was, there are those projects that are sort of in the pipeline that take down the classroom demand, and then there's this remaining demand, which, as we know, is 5 to 8 classrooms and then the suboptimal space. And so as we've talked about this, there are policy options for reducing the demand, and then there are capital options for addressing the demand. So we're going to go through each of these, and I think, on the policy option side, this is stuff that we showed this committee in the context of the conversations we had a few weeks back about the policy options on the operating side. But I'd like to spend more time on the capital because I think that's going to be new information for this group. So I just ask your questions, but I caveat it that way. So policy options. All right, so this is a chart you've seen before, that if there were policy changes that were made that eliminated, let's say, 2 classrooms per year, that it would take your need from 20 in FY19 to 10. You'd still have the suboptimal issue, but your classroom need would go down. So if you were to then apply, the BEEPs, the Lawrence modulars, and devotion, what it would mean is at the end of the day, you would have a surplus of 5 classrooms, which, if there's that BEEP discrepancy, for example, this might go down to 2, but nevertheless, you would have that. But you still have your suboptimal need as well. That's just, factual. You've seen this before. And then this is just what we were asked to quantify the cost of a classroom, and we did that, and it was a basic analysis that we'll incorporate in our report with some context depending on where this group ends up on the policy conversation. And just an observation from the capital side that there is a difference, and I think we've talked about this, but just to be clear, there's a difference between policies that reduce the population and those that don't. So things such as Metco and materials fee, where population goes down, you have a decline in need across all spaces. If you increase class size, you're not reducing the number of students, and so therefore you may not need a classroom per se, but there will be a cost for retrofitting or for otherwise addressing common space needs, such as cafeterias, gyms, this whole list here, that we need to factor in somewhere, because at the moment, those, if we continue to have growth, we will continue to burst at the seams in some of these places, and if we're not yet, we will be. Bless you. So particularly as we go down this, we did not do a lot of work in this area, although Sergio has done some ground laying work. It's going to be dependent on where we decide what we're exploring and how we're exploring it, and we can give information sooner rather than later if it's useful to the conversation, or we can be reactive to the policy conversation that this group has as a whole, so we can decide how to do that.
Yep. Points. One is we might want to add outdoor space on the bullet point, just since that's a big topic of conversation. The second one is that which is useful for everyone as we think about this. I think what's useful is thinking about it in terms of not all or nothing, but in terms of different options or different scenarios. So if this type of program change were to happen, if that type of policy change were to happen, because I think the all or nothing is interesting from a grand perspective, so we can wrap our heads around it. But when you're starting to kind of get down to this level, it would just be great to make sure that we're thinking not all or nothing, but what types of options there might be between 0 and 100.
Or a mix.
Right. And so
just make an observation that the open space, I think, would be rather problematic. Think of what's going to happen at Driscoll, a very dramatic increase on the same size site. So that would seem to be a much more negative outcome than adding perhaps 1 or 2 children to 27 classrooms. And in the case, if you add 10 classrooms at Driscoll School, as currently proposed, you're going to add roughly 200 children. If you add 1 or 2 children per classroom, you would add perhaps 50. If 200 children can play at Driscoll, 50 can. So I don't think you want to look at open space on this issue in that way,
you're saying that
unless you look at it across the expand in place policy as well.
I
Am I-
was making a much like dumber.
I don't get you, I don't understand your
I was
point.
just making a
I mean,
really
if the-
simple. Sorry, let me try it this way.
Okay.
I was making a really simple point, which was if you're using the word gym and lab and library, and you put the word open space out there, all you're saying is that when you increase class size, you have more kids out there on the playground, just like you have more
Jungle
kids
gym.
in the library. Whereas when you reduce Metco materials fee, you have fewer kids on the playground, just like you have fewer kids in the library. I was making a really simple
But,
point, not a big
but
point.
not just the need for, so you're saying the need for open space does not decline?
All I'm saying is that if the word gym is up there, the word open space should be up there. It's really a simple
Pressures are
point.
the same.
Right. It's a common space. The outdoor space is a common space, just like gyms and libraries. And
It's a really good point, because playgrounds, and it becomes a safety issue.
I'm agreeing with you, Sergio. It's really simple.
The numbers swings. Should you also include access to the building? We have big complaints about, with more students, there'll be more issues about parking and parents dropping kids off and that kind of stuff. I don't know, just
Well, that's that'll happen in, I mean, it's a feasibility question, for sure. I mean, this is a feasibility question, too. I mean, recognizing that you need growth in these spaces is one thing. Being able to figure out how the whole Lawrence, which I can't even really picture, but the Lawrence analogy of how they captured a hallway for, was it their auditorium or their cafeteria, is I mean, those are the creative things that would have to happen to address that, so.
Well, again, I think, I'm going to say this again because I think we're confusing things. Let's talk about Lawrence. Lawrence adds 4 classrooms. That's 90 children, right? There is no school to which you could add 90 children by a policy or staying to the policy of the school committee of adding another child or 2, because there is no school that has that number of classrooms. So the impact at Lawrence is significantly larger, and it did require an expansion of the cafeteria. For most schools, take a school of 27 that have 3 to 4 lunch periods, you're talking about 3 to 5 seats at any given lunch period. It's not a very large impact in my estimation. Now, does that mean that there are no common space problems? No. It means that it varies from school to school, and each one would have to be evaluated. And it has those variables to it, the number of lunch periods that they have, how they choose to have their lunch periods, what class groupings occur, whether gym classes are with 2 classrooms or 3 classrooms, how many home rooms, essentially. Or in the case of a library, which is essentially a single class. Now you're talking about 1 seat, 2 seats. So that's, as opposed to expand in place, where you're adding a very large number of classrooms, but the site hasn't changed. That's what I was trying to say in the case of Driscoll. You're adding 200 kids on the same playground.
I think that that these, as I understand it, Lisa, what you've put up here are some policy options that are available or could be available as opposed to expand in place.
Right, there's either the policy option or the capital option, or a
Right.
combination of
I mean,
both.
you have the policy options and the capital options. What we're looking at here,
Right.
Sergio, are the policy or practice options. And I assume we're going to get to
Yes.
the capital options later. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Sergio. If you expand a school by adding 5 classrooms or 10 classrooms or 4 classrooms, it is going to have impacts beyond adding a child or 2 to a class.
And that's a feasibility issue, making
Right.
sure that MSBA has.
But that's not
regulations
here.
for that, but that's not here.
That's going to be
Correct.
under your capital discussion. So.
All right, so moving on. So, capital options.
Oh.
So, what we did for capital options is, actually, did I? No. We looked at the expand in place recommendation, just to evaluate it, and we have some conclusions that we've shared with you, so I'll go through this quickly. But again, it's the Beeps, Lawrence Modulars, Devotion Rebuilding, then a Driscoll school at 4 section. Now, I think there have been numbers of there's 38 classrooms or whatever, but we actually came to the conclusion that we were trying to keep these schools fairly simple in terms of their sections. So if you figure that there are 9 grades, then however many sections you have per grade, you get to a 27 or you get to a 36. That's the way we're doing this math to kind of keep it straightforward. So we looked at Driscoll as a 4 section, which in our calculus meant that you currently have 26 classrooms. You would go to 36 to be a 4 section. And you were going to recapture in this math 3 sections of beep in these, because if you remember, there were 6 beeps, 3 of them were at Driscoll. And so you really are adding 7 physical classrooms in our model. This is not the same as the models that HMFH looks like. This is just for an understanding of what a 4-section school would look like. So if we were not to have access to one of those beep rooms, that number would go to 8. So what you're looking at is this total additional classrooms that have now jumped up to 22 against a cumulative baseline demand, which we went through earlier, of 20. This is sort of your steady state in September 18. This is after Devotion and Driscoll would be built. And so you have 2 extra classrooms, or it might end up being 1 extra classroom if you need to, 2 extra classrooms, and then the suboptimal spaces. So this is instructive because this is as far as the planning has taken folks on the expand in place. So we'll talk later about what's the next step, because actually we think that that's a critical component of this, because Driscoll needs to make sense, and it needs to make sense in the context of a broader plan, not to be just the stopgap. And so that's one of the things that became clear to us as we looked at this.
Lisa, how does the suboptimal drop to 8 from 12?
It dropped to 8 because of the Devotion rebuild.
So that's included in the rebuild, is picking up some of those suboptimals or optimizing them, or whatever you want to call it.
Because they've sort of grown into suboptimal spaces over time, and will have done that by the time they get to the rebuild. So, but they're only becoming again a 5-section school, which is 45 classrooms, but they'll have 50 classrooms total, so they only need 45. So that's to address the suboptimal.
Can you just repeat what you said about the beeps here, the treatment in this slide?
So this assumed that so Driscoll is currently at 26, or September 2014 is our baseline. So if it's at 26, it needs to go to 36 to be a 4-section school. We don't know what the other 2 to get to 38 were meant to be. Maybe they were for beep, whatever, but we're just addressing the K to 8. So you go from 26 to 36. And the way you get there was that if we were recapturing 3 beep spaces out of Driscoll, then you need to build 7 classrooms physical to get to the 36.
But
yes,
what I heard today is you're going to preserve 1 beep space at Driscoll.
Right.
So you'll only capture 2 at Driscoll, and you'll have to build 8 new at Driscoll, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So it will add 10 classrooms, essentially 10 K to 8 classrooms.
Right, and the thing that it's important to remember is the beep classrooms, whether it's 2 or 3, are being captured now. It's just important for people to understand that.
Okay.
So the beep classrooms are going to be used for K-8 kids in September 2014. Is that correct?
15.
In September? No, I'm saying when she's saying they're being recaptured now, the beep classrooms, yes,
Yep.
September 14 for 15.
So, fiscal year 15, school year 14 to 15.
Yes. Exactly. That's what I said.
Yep.
So
yes,
so they're being recaptured
correct.
now.
And I don't know, this policy of keeping the 1 beep in these 3 schools. Now, clearly Heath and Runkle were built for that, but again, I don't know what that means exactly. So,
If we absolutely needed the space, we would take them out from
that's
kindergarten.
that's what I'm saying. So if we were to, so we don't know that those.
Otherwise, it'd be beep there. I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. Is there really confusion about this?
No, we're just trying to understand the
Well,
numbers
there was
because she said
confusion
they're not
about
right.
this because we were not.
But I feel like you explained it very clearly.
Okay.
I thought she made the point that for at least Heath and Runkle, that because of the nature of the populations, the special needs populations that are there, that when those additions or renovations were done, they might have included certain OT things and what have you that you might not be able to get by moving those couple of classrooms outside. That was how I interpreted, but
I think it's still.
People in the building also. I mean, this is it gets back to Anne's point, which sorry. I mean, so this is a programmatic decision, right? Which is that it is the superintendent's belief that those children are better served given their need in the building with all of the resources available in the building. It may or may not be like something on the wall that but you're right. You're right. But again, if you need the space, they go to a temple and you.
And this is a priority thing, and one of the things we're learning is, things are evolving. The enrollment evolves. The understanding of what's going to happen when the enrollment evolves. Bringing Old Lincoln School online really provided a lot of outlet that, frankly, at the beginning of this process, we did not have. And so it may have been that when we talked to them before they rolled out the Old Lincoln School option, they were feeling they had to move all the beeps out. And maybe what has changed is, no, we can keep one because the classes we would have put there, we're going to be able to put at Old Lincoln. So I think, because we don't need them, to the earlier point, we don't need them for FY15, but we don't have the classroom need, but we can move them out if we want to. So is that clear? Okay. Sergio, do you have anything you want to add? Okay. So again, this is the chart you saw before with the Lawrence addition and devotion rebuilding numbers, but what we've added here is the Driscoll as a 4-section school. And again, this is cost, as we talked to you about in our interim reporting. We have costed this out to be a full renovation and an addition. Runkle-like is what folks call it. So that's how we get to the $53 million, which is significantly higher than the numbers that were used in the B space. And because if just not to reopen it, but I think everyone understands B space made a recommendation, and the school committee said no, not just an addition and renovation, but nobody ever made the cost connection. So we tried to make that cost connection, and we're landing at $53 million. So that brings, this is a number you saw prior to the public hearing, of approximately $170 million. These numbers don't round up, but we did do plus and minus. And then the town share, we would assume, or folks are hopeful, that Driscoll would have access to MSBA reimbursement. And the reason we know that that is the hope is that the town intends to file a statement of intent in April, early April. And, while devotion is the priority, we're hoping that, they are hoping that the MSBA will support a second application in a second school.
So I think I know the answer, but I just want to make sure. The $81 million out of 110 is not 35%, it's about 26%. Is that because they haven't raised the...
Right, yes, exactly. It's because they haven't raised the reimbursement.
Okay.
Yes.
Still at $275.
Right, and I think, we don't know if that would happen. Do people hear this? It's the cost of construction has gone up, but there's a cap on the cost per foot that MSBA will reimburse, and their cap has not caught up with construction costs, and they do adjust it as bids come in over the years. So the hope is maybe they reimburse more. It's a very, very good point, Cliff, because the hope is maybe they reimburse more, but at the moment, this is the number that is coming out through HMFH.
And it's 275 versus what's the 400?
400.
400,
Right.
give or take.
So does
Yes.
that make sense to people? I mean, it's a big difference. They're reimbursing at 275 a square foot, and the numbers are closer to 400 a square foot.
Right.
And
I think the Driscoll number's got an error in it. Can't be that low.
Well, because the renovation, it's the renovation factor that's a lot lower.
renovation is 200 something a square
Is that what
foot.
it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Well, for the cost, but also for the reimbursement. They don't
Right.
reimburse renovation at the same level.
Yeah, the, another item with devotion is that there is a parking garage there, which is part of the cost that is not reimbursed by MSBA.
Just one, I think it may be useful, just one of the reasons the devotion and Driscoll numbers don't look more proportional relative to the number of classrooms is there's an assumption of a lot more brand-new construction at devotion, which is basically twice as expensive as as sort of rehab at Driscoll. So that's one of the reasons proportionally the numbers don't, it's not, it's 4 classes versus 5 classes, but it's obviously not 4/5 of the cost of devotion, and that really, I hope, explains why.
And we have backup to this, but essentially the numbers we were using was the 400 for new construction, and I think it was 275 for renovation in some cases, and in other cases 200, depending on what the renovation was. So, so our observations on the expanded place, and these are just points that we've noticed that we want to make sure everybody else is aware of. Obviously, the approximately 2/3 of the cost of the expanded place capital cost is related to devotion, and this is just an important point. As we talked about, devotion is going down the path to happening, right? And so unless there was some dramatic change, that's going. And so the things that we can affect are what happens after that, and that is a small or proportion of this overall number. And it's just important to understand that. Does anybody have questions on that? Okay.
Wait, I have a question.
Yep.
How dependent is devotion? You say it's going forward and it can't be stopped, so to speak. But how dependent is that on the passage of an override, or isn't it?
So there's about, I'm going to sort of magnitude. So within the capital plan, the CIP, I think the Lawrence money is available, and there was roughly high to mid 50s available for a town share on devotion. So that increment is dependent on an override or some dramatic So there's some. I think a fair way of thinking about it is sort of 20, in the 20 to 25 range, if I'm getting my.
Well, I thought
would be required.
I thought what Sean has suggested is that there'd be a debt exclusion for devotion, and that Driscoll would come in the context of the CIP, not that you would take a certain amount of CIP and for devotion plus a debt exclusion, and then have a debt exclusion for Driscoll.
So those can both be true, and Sean did say that. I think Lee was saying how dependent is devotion. He was asking singularly on devotion.
Override is not approved, flat out.
Yeah.
No override. Is devotion still ongoing?
The
Well,
debt
it would be a
exclusion.
separate-
We, to answer the question as best I can, there was originally room in the CIP without a debt exclusion to do devotion. I think that was at the earlier numbers. I think now there is not, and we could have done that within the existing CIP without a debt exclusion vote, and that's a particular type of override vote. We could have done that at the old numbers for devotion. I do not believe that there is room in the CIP to do this type of project and also to do the other capital projects that the town needs to do on an ongoing basis.
In our understanding of the CIP, it's about 54 million.
50 million. That being said,
Does that make sense? There's a $54 million hole. When you take out Devo from the current CIP, it leaves a $54 million hole.
So I think try that.
Not an $81 million hole.
They're stated otherwise. If the town share of devotion was only $54 million, we could have done it without an override.
If you didn't do anything else.
But the town share of devotion is not going to be only $54 million. We will need an override for devotion. That override for devotion, if it pays for all of devotion, would free up space to do Driscoll in the capital budget without a further override. And the question will become, I think ultimately, how does the override get structured if you don't need Driscoll, but you do need devotion? And that's a question for another day.
The reason I'm raising this is that there are policy issues that are being discussed. Um, the policy issues are going to drive some of the capital spending, and if we
And they will also drive the operational
Yes.
side of the override
Right.
as well.
And my point is, if we sort of operate as if devotion is water over the dam at this point, then we may find ourselves dependent upon an override that may or may not happen without addressing policy issues that would affect the amount of the override.
Right. No, but you could.
I don't know if I'm saying that.
I understand what. I think what you're saying is, if you had an override for the equivalent of $81 million for devotion, that would free up space for Driscoll that you might not need. And therefore, for example, you could do an override that would allow devotion to go forward using part override or debt exclusion funds and part CIP funds. If you enacted a policy or practice changes, you would not need all of that. There would be money available that would otherwise go to Driscoll that would be available in the CIP to go toward devotion, supplemented by an override of a smaller amount.
But Lee, are you making the point that devotion may or may not be needed after policy?
Well, this is the question I'm raising. Supposing, for the sake of discussion, that it was decided that we would suspend further admissions to Metco and materials fee and increase class size by 2 so as to effectively reduce the need for classrooms by 4 per year. In fact, essentially wiping out the 20 or so classrooms that would otherwise be needed by 2019. Does that seems to me to change the program for devotion from an expansion to a renovation, correct or not correct?
Well, that's an interesting. If you reduce the classroom need by 4, you showed a reduction by 2 per year.
No, it was 2 per year for Metco and materials fee, and another 2 per year.
No, but what the capital subcommittee showed was 2 per year.
Okay.
If you did that at 4 per year,
For example.
what impact would that have on
I
devotion?
think that, devotion, we as a district need to renovate and deal with schools every, so often that they need to be done. And it seemed, I had heard, and maybe Sergio can speak more to this, but that devotion is going to be an expensive project no matter what, due to its, so even if you didn't get those additional spaces, or it would probably be an expensive project. But I mean, Sergio, I don't know if you're on the building committee. Is that accurate?
Would it be fair to say, well, it might be helpful to say, as a historical matter, when the decision went from the administrative and BEEP spaces to 5 classrooms, there was no, at that level, meaningful change in the price tag. Because essentially, I think that, and Sergio, I do think this was your point, which is that the other costs involved in the project are so much greater than what you use those 5 boxes for at the end of the day, that was not going to be dispositive in terms of meaningfully moving the number.
I think if I understand Lee's question, it's a hypothetical. If you were to reduce demand by 4 classrooms over a 5-year period, which is roughly when devotion would come online, you would not need to expand devotion to a 5-section school, number one, and you wouldn't need to do Driscoll either.
Yeah, so
Well, we can, then the question is, what would you choose to carry out? And presumably the answer is one or both of those schools would undergo renovation, and you can put numbers to that. I mean, you can guess what those are. Devotion is 150,000 square feet. Pick a renovation number, 200, 275, whatever, it's 30, 40 million instead of 110. And for Driscoll, you can do the same.
And we have.
Which we roughly have. Driscoll is 90,000 square feet, something like that.
So, I mean, this is sort of the point about the
It'd be
policy
20 million?
options. I mean, to be clear, the reason we frame this as two distinct pieces on this org chart is that there's the policy option, but we had to look at the capital in case there was no policy change or effective change implemented.
Right, no, I appreciate that, but I guess I'm asking is, I think it's also appropriate to look at the capital if there is.
Right, so the issue that I think Susan was saying that we absolutely need to do that, but I think the question is, what exactly do you model? And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg question. I mean, if what we're hearing is you would like us to model that scenario, we have the information to be able to do those scenarios, but they need to match up with Beth's operating cost analysis. So the one that we've done has been the taking away the 2 classrooms per year, because that's what Beth was also modeling, but we can do something else, and so that's just a conversation to have.
I'm not sure I agree with that. Beth was modeling sort of a one-year effect, and she wasn't looking at any of the capital-related classroom costs.
Correct, but the same policy has 2 sides, right? So you just want to make sure you're consistent.
I think what I hear Lee saying is we shouldn't predicate what we're doing on a vote that hasn't been structured or passed, and that what we've always talked about is worst-case scenario. If the voters don't approve it, you might be forced into those policy changes that you might not otherwise want to make. But if that's not your point, Lee, I'm not sure where we're going.
Well, I mean, it's sort of my point, but it's also, I keep coming back to, what we've been hearing from, our constituents for the last several months. Don't cut this, don't cut back, don't raise this fee, don't raise that fee. Everybody wants everything. And, under an everyone wants everything scenario, you may end up with everybody gets nothing. And I think that, the reality is that we need to sort of focus on, presenting the voters with a legitimate option I mean, there are going to be policy changes under any circumstance, whether it's raising parking meter fees or cutting back on programs or increasing class size or whatever, you name it. They're all policy changes. Some of them have more impact than others. But what I'm concerned about is the notion that, if we're talking about projects that are in some way dependent upon the override passing, then I think, that's a problem. And that what we need to do is we've been looking at options involving cutting back on the inflow of population, or cutting back on the number of classrooms by increasing class size. And I think that it's important that the capital subcommittee model those projects. The approach that I've used in terms of long-run incremental cost, I'm able to model the effect of reducing, effectively of reducing the inflow of students. If you eliminate X number of students, you eliminate, that times $16,000 a year roughly, or whatever the number works out to be.
Isn't what we should be modeling is what happens if we have no additional funds? I mean, shouldn't we work backwards from what we can do in the CIP?
That's another way to do it.
I mean, that's one way.
That's at least one scenario that the selectmen have asked us to model, which is what is the no override scenario? Absolutely, yes. But just to Lee's point, just to support Lee's point, I think what would be very nice is if we had a range of options to say, well, it's not all or nothing on any of these policy changes, but there are different types of scenarios you might have. And I think what you're asking, Lee, and you might not be asking this, but I'm asking it anyway, is the capital subcommittee, and I think I heard you say yes, going to come up with what happens under some various policy change scenarios? What are the capital implications? If you did X in terms of policy change or Y in terms of policy change or Z, or just some combination of those, what happens in terms of the capital cost?
This is scary because we are saying the same thing.
Yeah.
No,
So,
I fully support that point.
And I think Lee's scenario is kind of at a bracket. It's kind of like one end, and then you've got others in the middle,
Exactly.
but it is one end point, and that's worthwhile looking at.
And so just to be clear, are we talking about, because we've been able to kind of quantify generally, and again, on the policy side, I think we know that the capital is, as we've said, the tail as opposed to the dog. Is it that we want to model this to show what actual build-out scenario we would undertake and what buildings we would do? I mean, is that what we're looking for, as opposed to sort of the general, so we lose 2 classrooms a year?
Well, what I heard or thought I saw with one of your slides is that if you reduced the classrooms by 2 per year, and that trickled down, you would have 10 fewer classrooms needed in 5 years.
Right.
And I assume that would have some implication for the projects that would be needed.
Right.
And as I saw that, if that happened, you would have a surplus of classrooms if you did everything and that policy change. And I thought I heard you say that you would not have to do Driscoll.
You would not, in that scenario.
In that scenario, you would not have to do Driscoll. I think what Lee is asking is, what would happen if you reduced the classrooms by 4 a year as the outermost bracket, which is, I think, the most that anybody has said you could reduce it by a policy impact with regard to Metco, materials fee, and a slightly increased class size. Those, I don't think anybody has suggested you could get more than 4 classrooms a year.
So here's where you go on that, right? You go on the Lawrence edition, which is, that's 4 classrooms. And then devotion, right? So devotion, I'm not sure how you unpack devotion at this point to do something, you can do something different, but I'm not quite sure how to model it, because it's not like if you took out those 5 classrooms, Sergio, maybe you're more intimate with the numbers, but it seems, I'm not sure how you could just do a renovation, right? So maybe that's the one we should look at.
That's where it started.
All right.
Are we planning to present this as an alternative to taxpayers and say, if you put pressure on the school committee to remove Metco and material needs, then we won't have to have an override to do these additions? Is that where we're going? And the municipal committee today reviewed library hours and the fire department. We could say, let's see a model and see what happens if we don't do mutual aid. City of Boston doesn't take as good care of their property. Their inspections are more corrupt. We won't do mutual aid. Let's disaggregate how much we spend. How much would we save if we didn't do mutual aid? We don't go down that path because we need each other. We service many, many non-residents of Brookline in our public libraries. We don't go down that path and say, what would it cost if we said, we want to see your residents in Brookline before you use the library? We don't do that because we need each other. And now we are going to spend more time and ask for modeling to reduce a program that has proven over 40 years that we need each other. Now, we can put these numbers up there. I'm looking at them. But someone said, in reality, are we really going to entertain this? Are we going to continue down this line and continue to entertain this as if it's reality? Because I think you're going to need 3 or 4 rounds of school committee elections to get people in place there to change the policy. I would rather spend the time and the talent on this committee to really take a look at solid programs and what this is. If you present this publicly to the taxpayer and say, if we remove these non-residents, this is what can happen, you can have a vote and you can have a fight and you can spend a lot of time in the political handling of it. But I'm asking you, to what end? We already know that if out there we remove these programs, we would save the space, the time, and the energy of educating these youngsters. But to what end are we spending our time here with this?
Let me give you one answer, and that is that we can address the issue of having to subsidize the city of Boston to the tune of $4.5 million a year, and either get the city to come up with money or get the state to come up with money.
Well, Lee, if you want to go to the State House, and our representatives have done a terrible job, and they've heard from me personally, et cetera, on this, because the amount of reimbursement we've been getting has been decreasing every year. You want to take that battle? I'm standing right behind you. I got my picket lines. My picket signs are already painted.
Well,
But that's not the. But that's the place to fight this.
well,
It's not here.
well, if we keep, if we keep simply saying, listen, we're going to continue to take 300 Boston kids, come hell or high water. And by the way, it would be nice if you gave us more money. That doesn't get you the same answer.
Lee, that is assuming that the education process goes one way.
Can we
That
get back-
these
can we get
youngsters
back-
advance
can we get
this.
back here?
That the
Can we get back
youngsters
to what we're
advance
talking
this.
about here?
Wait, you have taken hours and hours and hours of our time. This topic. I will speak for another moment or two. You know when I'm finished because I'll stop talking.
Great.
Good. You're assuming that this advantage is only to the 300 youngsters who come here for their education. The advantage is also to the men and women on our faculty and to the youngsters that are educated beside these Metco kids as they're going through, whose testimony you heard. This is a mutual program. This is an education for all of us. This is a way for metropolitan Boston to deal with integration, unless you want to do 40B housing. There are other solutions, but this is the one we have.
Okay, and so let me try to say one thing here and move us back to capital. I think that one of the things that we've been asked to do as an override study committee is to understand what are the cost implications of the choices that we're making. And so regardless of whether or not at the end of the day the Metco program gets validated by this committee, validated by the school committee, validated by the community, whatever it is, I think that it is unquestionably the mandate of this committee to say here is the cost of some of those policy choices. So I think to the extent that we can present a cost to the community and the community can say, yes, we would like to pay that cost to support this program because we value it and we think it's important, or no, we don't, I think this committee is not going to, this committee, regardless of whatever else it does, has to present that cost. Is that fair?
I hear your argument.
Okay.
I am trying to see your side. I totally disagree with
Okay.
you.
And
I
I
think
think
the
one
other
thing
way
that's important here, let me speak just for a moment. We recognize your passion, and there are many at the table as well as in the community who share that passion. But that's not the question. It is not for you to decide. And that's what you're suggesting. And that is what I think this committee is rejecting. We must put this matter before the community, period.
And we do have to address the potential that in spite of the passion, in spite of what anybody feels, the voters will not accept an override, in which case you have to be able to somehow find a place for those kids that are going to go into the 20 classrooms. And if you can't find a place for them, you have to have fewer kids. And I don't think it's an option that any of us look forward to or like, but we need to put it out there because that's one way to say to the voters, you know, if this doesn't happen, these are the consequences. You've got to look at the consequences.
I hear you on that. I have spent most of my adult life to try to make sure that Metco doesn't have to exist. I have tried very hard to make the Boston Public Schools solid enough so Metco doesn't have to exist. So I totally get it. If you do put this out there, put it out in its full color. How much does it cost to be on page 3 above the fold of the Metco section of the Boston Globe with a black eye that says Brookline is turning down Metco?
You know what? I don't go for blackmail, and that is a form of blackmail.
Okay.
We're going to
All
call
right.
the shots the way we see them.
I think that the charge of this committee is to present information. And one of the aspects of that is what do the programs cost? And that's an operating cost, it's a capital cost, and what are the benefits of the programs? That is ultimately a policy choice for individuals. But I think that what is happening here today is an articulation of the capital cost, and what has happened earlier is an articulation of the long-run cost of these programs. And I think that unless you are willing to say, or this committee, and not you personally, but unless this committee is willing to say, we're going to keep all of these programs and all of these practices and policies no matter what they cost, then this is a valid examination.
So we will.
And we're not, and we can't say that. We can't say we're going to continue no matter what it costs, because that is not something I think that the voters are going to accept, particularly given the proposed scope of the override that's before us.
Can I say one other thing, which is that I'm not, just on your municipal point, I'm not sure that anybody assumes, I certainly don't assume, that if an override doesn't pass, the entire brunt will be borne by the school side. I think this the school's budget can't take it. We've had 35% growth. So back to your other point of, are there other avenues that we are looking at, either in terms of revenue or in terms of service cuts on the town side? The answer has to be yes. Because I think if we don't put together a no override, if the no override scenario only includes schools cuts, that will not be accepted as a valid no override scenario. So all I would say, I'll back on your other point on municipal, is please cost those out, because we need to see that. We need to see the costs of the choices that we're making.
And on the capital.
Why don't we continue?
Yep, I think that we're, I guess we feel that's kind of obvious about, if you have these classrooms, what that impact will be, but we will spell that out in a couple of scenarios because we have the numbers. It's just a matter of aggregating them and framing them with that question in mind. So we will do that. All right. So where were we? So we were on our observations. So I think we're on number 2, which is that it's just important to articulate that Driscoll was not in the capital plan to receive a renovation until after Pierce. However, it is in need of a renovation, and I think that looking at how to deliver classrooms, a renovation and a addition is a cost-effective way we found to be able to add classrooms to the district. So we use the $53 million number that reflects our estimates and to transform Driscoll into a 4-section school with a renovation and addition, as we discussed, Runkle Lake. There is a Driscoll MSBA statement of intent for April 11th, scheduled for April 11th. There is a sort of a draft that's being worked on. And what that means is the next step is feasibility. And so, that's where these questions get answered about traffic and about open space and about really how many classrooms you can add there and what the site can take. And I think, one of the things that became apparent to us, and this is the conversation about what's the next project, is that absent policy changes, that the Driscoll project just barely would address the remaining need, and so we need to identify the next project in the sequence so that we make sure that Driscoll isn't just the size of Driscoll isn't being driven by the need, but rather what's reasonable on the site. So, does anybody have anything to add on these observations? Sergio and Tim, to start. Sorry, Jim. No.
Why don't you ask the question? I'll try to answer.
What is my question is, could you expand a little bit on the last bullet? In the absence of the next project in the sequence.
Well, I think that it's. I think it goes around the language of Driscoll, which is the question about how it needs to address this need, and there wasn't a next project articulated.
So you're saying we don't know
Pierce,
what the next project
right? I mean, they've said so. Pierce has been out there, but one of our recommendations is to look into that further, figure out what really is the next project, what's the capacity of, so that Driscoll bears what it can instead of absorbing the need that's been articulated.
So is this saying the Driscoll site and the context, comma, not the remaining need, should drive the number of new classrooms?
Yes, probably.
Okay.
Jim?
I think you're commenting on the fact that Driscoll's going from 19 to possibly 36 or 38, so I get it, yeah. I have a question on some...
No, I think it's really it's on the physical, the physicality.
I understand. So I have a question that's completely, somewhat off the grid here, and it's about Old Lincoln School. And I'm wondering if the capital subcommittee has looked into the opportunity cost as well as the real cost of maintaining old Lincoln School. And I asked this for my youngest daughter, who said to me, "Why do we have an empty school? I don't know any other place that does."
So glad
So
you asked
I'm
that
wondering,
question, Jim.
I mean,
I have a
after
whole slide on that.
anything on the other on the other side of 2019, 2020, whatever, when old Lincoln School's not being used, have you guys looked into what are the right?
We'll keep going. So, other K-8 options, Old Lincoln School. We spent a lot of time just now going over the expand in place option, which is the option that has been addressed and adopted by the school committee and recommended by HMFH. We did want to think about some of those other issues or those other options that may have been somewhat explored and just sort of take a fresh look at them. We reviewed a couple of options, dismissed through, we reviewed all the options that B-Space put forth for viability. So we wanted to check on the ones that were recommended. So we looked at, Lawrence and Driscoll and Devotion and the Beeps. But we're not interested in reopening the options unless it's deemed the options that were deemed politically unviable through B-Space unless there's a critical reason. So if there's a significant cost savings or something, we wanted to relook at it. If it was just sort of, it didn't seem like it was an undesirable site, people didn't want to do it, but there didn't seem to be an advantage from a cost perspective to doing it, we didn't reopen those. So the things that we did look at, because we felt that this one sort of hadn't been explored enough, and we just looked at it from a cursory standpoint, was having a new grade 7 to 12 to complement BHS, which would mean that you would make the existing elementaries a K to 6. So we didn't take a deep dive on this one because we felt that if you're changing how the schools are structured, a K to 6 or 7 to 12 is very different from a K to 8 to 9 to 12, that really should come from pedagogical drivers and not necessarily come from a capital need. However, we do observe that building one 7 to 12 school in South Brookline is likely a very cost-effective option for addressing the space demand. So it's just simply an observation, and that's as far as we went on that. Go ahead, Sergio.
I think it's worth at least saying once more that there are a number of advantages to such a model, which not only would simplify the current dilemmas which surround the expand in place, the notion of children who are in transition, at least 3 or 4 of our K-8s being construction sites and so forth that we've spoken about. But also there are at least some educators who suggest that the K-8 model is strongest when the size of the school stays at 3 sections or less. Now, I'm not an educator, so I don't know if that's accurate, but there's certainly people who've expressed that. And that, again, would be one argument why in the words there of pedagogical drivers, those words came from a letter that the superintendent wrote to the school committee at the time when the school committee asked his opinion about the K-6, 7, 12 model. And it was his structure here. And again, not being an educator, I would just suggest that there are some pretty significant pedagogical drivers, which include the kind of disruption that we've discussed, as well as the issue of the size of the schools.
But we're the capital subcommittee, so we didn't.
No,
so we didn't.
That's right.
Assume that was the.
By the way, in the second bullet point, the 712 also requires the high school to be modified from its current 912 configuration to be a 712.
Is there any space that you're considering over there? I heard Los Anderson, South Brookline. Is there not there yet?
We don't have any specific site in mind. That was one that was discussed, and there were some people who I think were very concerned about that concept, and there were others who thought it was a good choice.
And I think the only point we wanted to make is solving this question, solving this issue with one new building if you could do it, it has a lot of advantages. But, this is a much more complicated question than a capital question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you built that one new building 7 to 12, would it leave you capacity in your current K-8 schools to absorb what might be coming with Hancock Village?
Well, it generally had the function that it created for each school, took out the 7th and 8th, which gave a lot of capacity for on-site expansion for the K-6 portion. The notion of Hancock, I think, to us represents more of a point problem, a very large point problem if it comes, but it's also somewhat localized, and it may have much more impact on Baker being right there than necessarily wanting to redistrict and spread all of that across a number of schools. Again, these are policy kinds of choices. I think one question I would ask my colleagues is whether or not the capital subcommittee should leave this, or whether we should at least try to price the costs related to making a 712 school, which would be quite large, by the way, in terms of as a school, because it would have to handle about 1,200 kids.
I guess the question is if you could do it without requiring an exclusion. If one of the options we're supposed to look at is nothing passes, so nothing passes, yet what do we do with all those kids? If this helps answer that, yeah, it would be nice to see.
I think to Sergio's point that it would be expensive. I don't know. We'd have to look at it, but maybe we should.
Just one other consideration that B-Space raised was the site location. So I think if you're actually going to consider this as an option, you're going to have the discussion of where, because it was not just pedagogical options, it was a site location.
This was also just very, very disruptive, I will say, in B-Space relative to MSBA relations. So in terms of having the core of approvals they've made on K-8 schools and having devotion in front of us, we really did not do a deep dive on this, I think for reasons of not wanting to reopen old wounds, which were quite deep and still felt. So,
why, just out of curiosity, why this instead of a middle school? Because it strikes me that having 7th and 8th and 9th graders and 12th graders just is, I'm not sure I understand that. Just out of curiosity.
In listening to the debates during B-Space, what I got out of it was that it was 7-12, but it's really divided as 7, 9, 10, 12. And so I don't know. Again, I'm not an educator, so I don't feel this is an area where I have a lot of insight.
And that's why it's hard to cost it, because we don't know what it would look like, and again, we don't know where it would be sited. I mean, so it's efficient that we know, but we're not recommending it. And I think to Susan's point about finding a location, I mean, if this were deemed something people would want to do, the political will to find a location would probably happen. But I think there are so many other issues related to it. I mean, I think the best we could do is put a general cost of, throw a square footage to it and throw a cost to it.
Just out of curiosity, getting back to the MSBA question, how far down the road did people from the school committee or B-Space actually go with MSBA in talking about the options and why we might have to do it?
Which option?
Well, a going away from the K-8 model, or did we just get pushback from them and basically said no? I mean, did we have really in-depth discussions about the issues here?
I think this has been explored. I don't think there's any more exploration to do with this. I think the political will on changing from the K-8 model among the Board of Selectmen, unless Dick feels different, the school committee, and the large committee is zero.
And it does feel like if we were in a no.
I think this one's going nowhere. It doesn't mean you can't, feel free to go pound sand.
We weren't inclined to take it any further, except to just acknowledge that we had looked at it, that it's not something we missed or didn't look at, right? So that was.
Just let us turn the slide. Come on.
And it seems like, but
don't do more analysis.
Right. But I do want to say that that in terms of a in terms of a no override scenario, it seems like there are probably other things that would happen before you'd get to this change. Okay, so one of the things that we looked at was the new K-8 at the existing Old Lincoln School. So this was a scenario where we looked at the same, similar to Jim's daughter, we looked at an empty school and we said, why wouldn't you use that? And it just seemed to us like a very low-cost option. We're not talking about the option of obtaining the U-Haul site and expanding it hugely and et cetera. We're saying that, there are 20-some classrooms there, and why wouldn't you use that, at least for some period of time, depending on what we believe is the future of enrollment. And so we looked at renovating it. We put costs to it. We actually really dove into this one. And we'll show you the cost in a minute, but it is the least expensive option for the most amount of classrooms. But we did end up ruling it out for a number of reasons. And the first one was that there really is a value to having Old Lincoln School as swing space in the near and long term. So there is, as bullet number 2 points out, we have this immediate need where we have to find a place to put students in the near term until some of these projects come online. But even beyond that being able to renovate schools and having some place to put the students, or renovate town buildings and having some place to put the students, I think they've used it in 10 examples over the past 15 years or so, and that the value of that both to the community and in terms of cost was something that we were fairly swayed by. And then the other thing that sort of changed during the course of us looking at this option was the realization and the articulation that Old Lincoln was going to have to become a overflow school for some period of time. And so, where would you put the kids while you were renovating? Just from a practical standpoint, how would you even get to renovating this to be a permanent school? So from a practical standpoint, we didn't think that this made as much sense, but we have the numbers, we have the information. If we rethink this in the context of a no override scenario, this could come back. And that's part of what we're trying to do tonight, is just share with you what we have, see what else you need, and then we're going to figure out sort of where it goes. But just the last point on this is that there was also a low probability of MSBA funding because it's a renovation, which they don't particularly seem to favor, which is not a very sustainable approach, but whatever. But also just the ability to meet their standards in terms of class sizes and common spaces, like classroom sizes and common spaces and such, was going to make this difficult. And then in terms of timing, we were thinking about, could you get this online very quickly? And that, MSBA has a very long lead time. So all of that had us taking this off the table as like a recommendation. I think at the beginning we thought this might be our recommendation, but I think we're not, while we have the information, it could come back, we're not recommending it.
Can I just, I guess, a couple things. I guess my understanding from MSB, and certainly Sergio would know more about this, that renovation is something they consider as a positive generally. But setting that aside, I was asking a different question. I wasn't saying that Old Lincoln School is the answer. I was wondering, on the other side, let's assume that we go ahead with Devotion, we go ahead with Driscoll, and say we reach 2020, 2022, and we have an empty school on Route 9.
Mm-hmm.
What is the ongoing sort of, have you guys thought about what's the opportunity cost to the town leaving like if you had
Jim, let me cut to the chase.
Yeah, please.
The question is, why shouldn't we sell it off as a development site?
Or what does it cost us to even just to know what does it cost us to maintain and all that?
So we did look at this pretty carefully. We engaged with our colleagues on EDAP, the Economic Development Advisory Board, along with Kara Bruton, and we put together information concerning the value of the property, whether it had rental value, so that during the time that we didn't need it as a town, it might be rented, and or whether it could be sold. Selectman Goldstein, for example, has been an advocate for selling the Lincoln School for a long time. And I remind us that when we built the new Lincoln School, that was the immediate goal, was to sell Old Lincoln. Well, let's look at what's happened in those 20 years. As Lisa has reminded us, there have been 10 separate occasions when the town itself used the building, 6 times for schools and 4 times for town projects. So fire and safety was over there, the health was over there, the town hall was over there. the schools have been there and so forth. And the savings that we have achieved as we looked at that in terms of making our construction projects quicker and without having students on site have been very large. There is very little reason to believe, in my personal view, I mean, somebody may have a different one, to think that if you looked at the next 20 years, that things would be any different. We will continue to need to renovate buildings, schools as well as town projects. And so the expectation would be that some similar kinds of use would be made of the school. The second is to ask, well, okay, but there's an opportunity there. Everyone that we spoke to suggested that the value of the property was actually very low. It's a very awkwardly sited facility with no parking. The obvious uses here would be either for something like housing, if it were to be reused in the way that schools sometimes are, or office space. The site doesn't lend itself very well to these. And so the general information that we've been receiving was that what the town would actually gain is relatively small, even allowing for the fact that in most sales we'd get tax revenue, right? But even if you go through that, you get there. And between now and 2020, there is in fact no opportunity, since it seems to be very much on the table. So we kind of left it at that point, and therefore I think my short answer would be it should be looked at again at that time or shortly before that date.
And the projects I think that, envision using it are the high school potentially in the short term, and then also, Pierce does eventually someday need to be renovated.
Well, that's all the schools.
Right. So
it's a normal cycle.
Yeah, but we're specifically we've envisioned which projects would be up next. It's not hypothetical.
Yeah, I mean, Jim, you know that the town has a CIP cycle, and we go through all of the schools, and we've done 6. We've got 2 to go, and then presumably at that point we start the cycle again. Now, it's true that it's not in use every year, and even during this period, there have been periods. We did rent it twice, once to the ART, and I guess twice actually to what's now known as AI, right? The school, the culinary school.
And to your point, Sergio, the superintendent said that he has gotten requests from other school districts to use it as swing space for their districts also. So, like Needham asked. That's the one I know of, but I think there are others. So anyway, I think to Lisa's point, there's a plan for the next 10 years, and God help us if anybody can predict year 11 of anything, but there is at least reason to believe that there could be continued use.
I mean, essentially it seems that there's high value as an empty chair, and there's relatively little residual value as an outright development opportunity currently.
So we've started thinking about this in terms of near-term and long-term planning. And this is the point that we raised earlier, which is that the site, the Driscoll, assuming that Driscoll can accept the projected number of classrooms, the Driscoll addition barely addresses the classroom need. And there are other pressures in the district. So this is part of the question about what does the future look like? What do you think? Do we think that there will be continued growth pressures? Do we think that there will, how do we feel about the suboptimals? And, all of this has costs, but if, there needs to be a next project identified in the sequence, at least for planning purposes. Pierce is a logical next project, but one of the challenges with Pierce is that it's just such a hooking, well, Tim, I don't know if you want to describe the challenges of Pierce, but it was the next step on the CIP, and it's understood to be in need of renovation, but it's a bear, and so the idea really would be that you take it down and rebuild it, or it would be something closer to a devotion project than a Driscoll project. But it has a lot of advantages. It's well located to the population growth. The building site is large, and it should be able to take a significant number of new classrooms, although we don't know. No study has really been done on this. So what we are going to be recommending is that there's a Pierce study that talks about how many classrooms could it add, and how could it be sequenced and phased, and what would the cost be. because it's important to understand that next piece. We keep hearing that Pierce is the next one, but what does that mean, and what is that, and then how do you think about, for specifically Driscoll in that context of knowing this other thing may be coming? And again, there's cost to this, but we were just looking at the capital options for addressing the identified need. There could be a whole host of policy changes that affect all of this, but it is important to kind of keep this going. The one thing we did want to raise is that devotion was not on the table due to, for now, because there isn't really a place to put the children, because devotion needs to use Old Lincoln. And there is this there are three options, Sergio, for devotion?
There are 8 which have been weeded into 3 families.
Okay. So, and one of that might be building something new next to something old so the children wouldn't need to move. And so it could be that there's an opportunity at Lincoln at this point to relocate some of the students and address some of the relocation of student need during a devotion project. And so the question just is, is devotion better, is Pierce better located, or is it a good location? Would you want, we've heard this is actually where you want classrooms. So, this is sort of somewhat of an unformed thought, and Tim, I don't know if you want to jump in and clarify it a little bit, but it's something, it's a little bit of a moving target, but it's something nobody's looked at, so we don't have a lot of data on it.
Can you just give an indication about timing for something like this that you're thinking?
Well, no.
How soon?
Well, I mean, I think.
So here's what I would say about Pierce, and I think this is where we think Pierce is a big project. So if you've been Pierce is for folks who don't know, Pierce is an open classroom. So it basically has this big open area that does not have 4 classrooms. I don't know how anyone could possibly renovate that with students, right? So it's going to be, and there's a fair question about whether or not you'd want to repeat that experiment again. So it was next up. It's in a better part of town, I think, to add classrooms. It's a bigger site to add classrooms. It's not a good site for adding expanded classrooms. And I think that's essentially why it was not really looked at viably as part of the B-space exercise. But I think there's a lot of students there. So to do Pierce, you really need to have access to Old Lincoln School and then some to be able to think about where you put all the students. So I think our sense is the town should really start thinking about Pierce as a more comprehensive plan and thinking about it as what's going to happen there. So your question is when. And when's that going to happen? How do you think about Old Lincoln as part of that? But it was next up on the to be done, so it presumably needs improvement more. And I think Driscoll, for reasons of sort of looking at where you could expand as more of a sure thing, I think that, and also shorter term, smaller costs kind of bumped it over. So I think there's reasons why it makes sense to have done that, but I think looking at Pierce long term or even medium term and what you're going to do there is an important exercise.
I guess my question is, I guess I understand all that. I guess my question is from a potential override perspective and information for taxpayers.
Yeah.
What is your perspective on the timing for something like this? Because, it gets back to the issue of what are you going to tell people they're going to be coming out of pocket for, in 2 years and then again in 4 years? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Right.
Is it 8 years out? Is it 4 years out? Or 3? What's your perspective?
I mean, I think this is.
Given no policy change.
Right, that's the point, is sort of given no policy change, because, I mean, I think that if you believe in the remaining need and there are no policy changes, then you have to figure out how to address it. And what we're showing is that Driscoll can't address it all. And so thinking about that next it flies in the face of what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to figure out how to not spend as much money. But what we looked at the capital side very purely without any policy changes, right? So that starts to show you that push and pull.
So let's use brackets, right? It's not 2 years and it's not 25. So it's right. So it's sometime and it's a big project, and I think it's a big project that you're not going to be able to do inexpensively. So I think and it's been articulated as sort of the next thing up after the expand in place items Lisa went through, and there's some.
No, after
No,
that.
sorry, after
right.
sorry, I'm
For
talking
under
K-8. So it's sort of within sight, and there is a need there. So I think we felt like we obviously had to kind of highlight that. In terms of
The only
exactly
thing I
when
would say is that everybody understands that Driscoll, the Devotion, and the high school are gigantic projects to swallow. So I don't think so. So to the extent that those three go first, it does move Pierce out. It's not the next 5 years. There's just no. I mean,
And actually, let me just reinforce that point. I think one of the reasons I think Driscoll is going next partly so that there isn't a second big project like Devotion lined up. I mean, so I think that's not. It's a more manageable fiscal project as to Driscoll than Pierce would be.
The way the school committee voted this was after this tranche. So this was not in the next 5 years.
But I think, so here's really what it comes down to, is that, we're moving forward, well, the recommendation is to go ahead with Driscoll. And we hear, were there other options that were looked at? Pierce wasn't really looked at, a K-8 wasn't really looked at, but the challenge of looking at those is that you're reopening the MSBA conversation, which we have a slide on, but it's important and something to think about. And I think how we got here was actually more addressing alternatives to the options on the table and making sure we had thoroughly looked at those options. But so if some of this strikes, that we would want to do this instead, but that's not. But we can't. We've heard loud and clear that the MSBA relationship is that we're in a better position to get funded if we have certainty, and that reopening any of that could undermine our certainty of plan.
So put another way, there is a lot to be said about Pierce being done ahead of Driscoll. What's not to be said for it is it's going to be much more expensive, and I think the outcome would be much less certain. So I think that's a reason not to have it proceed, but I think we felt like describing that is important so people kind of get a sense for what the plan is. Pierce is the later relief valve as to K-8, and it's a fairly sizable project, and it is relatively far out, but it's on
But it
the
also tells
horizon.
you that there's this delta in between that we've addressed.
The go-it-alone option, and
What's the go-it-alone?
Saying, well, forget about MSBA, we want to do, K through 6 in the middle school instead, and do it on our own.
So we didn't look at that for the K to 6, 7, and 12 because, of all these sort of pedagogical issues where we thought, unless somebody says they want to do that, capital maybe shouldn't drive that. And plus, we don't have information on it, but we could model that. We did, obviously, on all the other ones, the reason we showed the total project cost in the town share is because if you chose not to go with MSBA, you know what that number would be. So that's certainly an option. But I'm not sure where you would. I mean, I'm not sure the trade-off of being able to have a conversation about a different project is worth risking that money because it's a significant amount of money.
I think you have to understand the question a little bit differently. There's a distinction in my mind between saying that we'll go on our own, staying within the K-8 model, because that does not jeopardize the funding commitments that MSBA has made to the K-8 model, which now includes Heath, Runkle, and Devotion. Okay? If you pursued on our own a K-6, 7, 12, that I think would become a much more difficult item to pursue. So I think it's important to understand that difference.
And we did, for example, look at going it alone on an old Lincoln way back when solution, and because that was actually still cost effective. So that's where we are in Pierce. The other thing that we looked at was a standalone K-8. We understood, and we've been hearing that a new K-8 was really everyone's first choice during the B-Space process. And, it's consistent with the model of neighborhood schools, provides additional capacity to accommodate additional growth because you would get, at least 20, if it was a 3-section school, you'd get 27 classrooms. So you could return BEEP back to the schools. There's a lot of advantages to having overcapacity in one project. There's also a new construction project alleviate some of these issues that Sergio was talking about, this, the logistical challenges of trying to either relocate students or build around students or phase students in the safety and disruption, et cetera, which also translates to benefits and schedule and cost. If you can just, go in and build a building, it can be done much quicker than trying to navigate around an existing one. So, we thought about that, and we understood what happened with MSBA, with B-Space, that a lot of town-owned properties were looked at because the charge was to have a school up and running by September of 17. And so the easiest way to do that is on land you own. But one of the things that they didn't look at was aggressively was looking at land that the town does not own. So we were sort of thinking about that and thinking that it might be useful in the future to really get a handle on what properties could be available from that private land could be available, that could be assembled, what the cost of that would be, what that would mean from a tax perspective, what that would mean from a time frame perspective. So that is another recommendation that we have, is to just really get a handle on that, so that if in the future, this wants to be an option, that we look at it. Obviously the goal would be a friendly acquisition, but there's nothing more supportable in an eminent domain scenario than building a school in a congested town. So it's just something to think about. I don't, that wasn't really, we noted it as a gap that wasn't really explored. So I don't know if Sergio or Tim has any comments on that one. All right, so this is the cost comparison that we did. Again, we looked at existing Old Lincoln as a 3-section school, and again, this was just, because we did this work, we're showing it that it was a very cost-effective way of getting a significant amount of classes, somewhere over 20, depending on how efficiently it could be redone. The Driscoll renovation and add into a 4-section school, again, we've gone over these numbers, but this is the $53 million, with the town share being $34 million. These are all approximate. A new site, we did look at, okay, if you built a 3-section school on a new site, what would that cost? And the construction cost of that is very similar to the Driscoll renovation 4-section, but a couple things happen. One is that you have to account for the land in addition to the construction cost. So there is an acquisition cost, whether it's eminent domain or a friendly. It's and that the cost of that land is probably, take a guess, $10 to $20 million. But we think that's why it's worth kind of exploring this a little bit, to understand what that cost could be in the future. Obviously, a new school would gain you, if it was a 3-section school, 27 classrooms. But the thing that doesn't get you, in addition, is the renovated Driscoll, right? So the Driscoll renovation, which is the column all the way to the right, is you're renovating 90,000 square feet, and you're at about $21 million in addition. So, I think this does show the Driscoll renovation and add is a cost-effective way of getting a renovation of all the existing classrooms there, and it was on the list for eventually, but you only gain 7 classrooms, and if we think that there is a need for more classrooms, say our need was 20, you might be looking at doing something new, because that's actually quite a cost-effective way to get a lot of classrooms. So we don't, this is just for comparison's sake. This is for people to kind of think about. We've done the work. And, obviously the issue for consideration at this point where we are is MSBA, because they're an important partner and they can reimburse. The problem is you're always sort of uncertain as to how much reimbursement you're going to get. Well, eventually but during the early phases of planning, you're not sure. So a lot of these numbers are, projections. The other question is how many projects they will support in a particular municipality. So, we have a lot of projects that we're undertaking. We feel like we have a good demonstration of need, and we can get support for that. When I say we, I mean the schools and the town. But, you never know. And they also have, something to understand is the long schedule of reviews and milestones. And so, you submit the SOI, and then they expect that you will be on a very linear path from there. And we have understood that, veering from that path can have implications from the town's relationship with MSBA and sort of the certainty of what kind of reimbursement we would get. So, the certainty of plan increases the strength of your application and their participation, and expand in place the current plan. So, unless we have an appetite for taking other risk, that's kind of where we are. So our recommendations at the moment, these are just sort of potential thoughts, are having a peers, a study to look at peers just to really understand that, because so we don't talk about it in the vacuum. And then looking at non-town owned land and just to understand what's out there and what the opportunity is. And there's value in understanding that there isn't anything out there as well. So, we may want to recommend at some point looking at this and just to understand whether there is an option or there isn't an option. If there is an option, what the cost would be. And if there isn't an option, understanding that, expand in place is the way to go for us. So does anybody have, and then the high school. So, we reviewed the high school, but the long and the short of this is that there's a consultant being studied. We don't really have enough information to do much on the high school. So we have a plug number that we've been carrying, and that's kind of that. So our next step is feedback from you all, continuing to work with our colleagues on the policy options and making sure that we talked a lot about that today, the scenarios that we want to model, so we can do some of that. And then just we will wrap all of this up in a bow and try to address those issues about the CIP and what if there was no override, how would we fund it, what would happen, so some of the funding strategy stuff. So Tim and Sergio, do you have anything else you want to say? All right.
The thing I'd say is I do think sometimes the OSC reports leave important markers for folks down the road. So I think some of these recommendations are very useful in terms of long-term planning. Because there's obviously a plan in place and then things that may need to come from it and a lot of unknown. We do think trying to flesh out what some of the unknowns are is useful as a long-term planning exercise.
And I think on your first two bullets, feedback from OSC colleagues and continued work with colleagues on impact of policy options, I think you've heard a lot today.
Right. Yep.
I would just ask, based on what we've heard today, is there anything else that members of the OSC would like to communicate to the Capital Subcommittee to look at beyond what they are looking at now? I mean, I personally think you've packaged this in a way that really does provide some clarity as to what is happening year to year that we have, as a town, have not seen before. And I think that's a tremendously valuable service.
I'd like to underscore Chairman Banker's comment. It really looks good, and it shows an enormous amount of work. And I'm especially mindful of Pierce, I'll say, in full disclosure. I have 4 grandchildren there. There's a bad karma in Pierce. It rained inside in Pierce for about 10 years when they did the sleeve on that building. But I really do think it's important to I don't want to say target, to point it where that is and what's happening, because it's the Pierce-Driscoll line in terms of moving the kids and relocation. I would like to see some, and the superintendent talked to Pierce a few nights ago, but I guess just talked about the relocation of kids over to the old Lincoln. I don't know, I wasn't at the meeting. But I would like to see a 5-year out or even a 10-year out plan, because you're going to have kids who are in major construction through much of middle school and then go up to the high school where it's likely they're going to be through major construction. So, and if they're going to be displaced, that would be really good. But it looks like really good work, and I was happy to see the Pierce highlighted.
Thank you. We'll note that. We have seen, just to Ann's point and question about the overlap of kids, there is a working document. Again, it's changing, but we have seen how the schools are thinking about that, so we can incorporate that into our report.
Anything else for Lisa?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Email your slides to me, please.
Yes.
Yeah, which we've actually talked about similar reports by, schools
Is
and
that still happening? March
Cap-
19th?
Maybe the program committee.
capital
Well, we just, this isn't done, right? I think
You mean
we do need
revenue?
some
revenue.
Next
update.
week?
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
so,
Tell you what,
one second. So can we just talk about this for 1 second? I mean, here's where we stand, which is that I think the idea was to get this level of report out from everyone. It didn't have to be solid final recommendations or votes or anything like that, although we were hoping fiscal policies would take what they had done and turn it into votes since they thought they were so close. But clearly, the capital team needs a fair amount more work after this, which is fine. But I think the question was, could we get that first deep dive pass through everyone, because the next piece of this is going to be putting all of it together, and so each subcommittee is going to have stuff to do, but then we really have to start putting these together, and if we keep kicking the can, it's going to be much harder to do that. I also just want to be mindful that next week is March 19th, and then there's one more Wednesday, and then we would give some sort of update to advisory, and it doesn't have to be, again, it's not final, we're not ready for any final reports, but just where we are. So if there's unless there's a reason not to, I actually would like to hear from the schools next week on where things stand. I think we still have revenue and municipal, and there's still a few more that need to happen the week after. But
We have a full committee meeting, full subcommittee meeting. We're going to meet our task force meeting tomorrow. Do we have a full subcommittee meeting before next Wednesday?
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it's also certainly possible that you could report out as task forces.
Probably need to do that because the entire subcommittee hasn't met.
Yeah, that probably
very
makes.
long time.
Probably, I mean, they're,
but then that has to happen.
So
So with all due
can-
respect, like that.
But
Yeah,
that's,
the
well,
problem
that's,
is a lot of our meetings have been canceled due to snow,
I got it.
and we're catching up.
I got it.
that's the chair, so I mean, actually, not to
Okay. No. Then
suggest
she's
that
got to
it's
do
her
it.
issue, but,
Then that's the conversation.
I guess
Well,
we
no,
could,
I
we
can
could,
make it
we could do that.
Yeah, why wouldn't we do it as task force?
We could do it.
I mean, I can't.
The reason we wouldn't do it as task forces is because theoretically the task force is supposed to report up to the entire subcommittee so that everyone on the subcommittee can actually talk about what each other have been doing. I mean, I thought, that was what we had discussed. But
I mean, my own personal view on the population subcommittee is that it's going to be hard for the full schools committee to get to a recommendation, except to just further along the recommendation of the full, the discussion to the full override subcommittee.
So, the task force, there are certain things where we might make recommendations, broad recommendations. There are other things where we're actually presenting, I think, lots of options without necessarily, going and voting down a list of what those are. But we haven't even, as a task force, addressed some of those things yet.
do you have a meeting prior to next
We have a
Wednesday?
meeting tomorrow,
Can you
which,
tell us after that?
excuse me?
Can you tell us after that if next week is reasonable?
Yeah, it really
I mean,
depends on what we're gonna get through. I mean, we've gotten through some things. Each time we meet, it's, things just keep.
There are
Stretching.
many permutations, and we're looking at many different pieces.
One of the problems with the task force is that there are probably like 8 or 9 different things that I don't know if it's that many, but we've actually done some fairly deep dives on. So each one, we could I'm sure we can talk on some of them. Others, I'm not sure, but we'll try to get there.
Why don't we
We'll try to
see
get there.
tomorrow
Yeah.
how much we can pull together and know what are the things we haven't covered yet.
Maybe.
And I think we're trying to take them so that the larger ones and the more aggravating ones have been surfaced. So we're down to things like use of the gyms and stuff like that we haven't even talked about.
Well, we haven't really talked about either materials for your Metco either.
I think,
Other than raising that they're big and.
yeah, and maybe, if we set a more modest goal, and that is not to make recommendations, but rather to report as to where you are in more detail than has happened to this point, can that happen?
Well, would it be helpful for
but I think some sort of synthesis as to what are the most important points.
Why don't, after your meeting tomorrow, why don't you get in touch with Susan and me, and let's try to, I mean, we'll we have until next Monday to set the agenda for Wednesday's meeting, but I think Susan is right. Let's, to the extent we can.
Even if it's just a learning session. I mean, to your point, I mean, you've made the point very eloquently that, there's just so much to get everyone up to speed on that it might need 2 bites at the apple anyway. So even if it's just the learning session on, here are the 6 or 7 big issues and the main considerations and the cost drivers and cost components, even if you're not inside, the next step is to turn them into recommendations. But there's just a lot that you've done that you can synthesize.
So, well, I'm gonna take the step then of sending around the draft. People have heard Lee's thing already. Right. The draft, people can flip through it, and get what they want out of it, and then we can try to talk about some specific things.
Do these documents have executive summaries of any kind?
Mine does.
His does, mine really doesn't.
And Janet, you were referencing one of these when you were saying they were very long.
We've all pretty much seen Lee's.
Well, you've seen the spreadsheets,
right,
but you haven't seen the narrative.
Right, but we at least reviewed some of what's in there.
Yeah.
The other stuff, as I said, I opened it. It was 53 pages. I said, no, I can't print this out. I've sat through a lot of the meetings, so I know what's going on.
You know what?
What you
I'm.
do is bullet points.
Well, I could certainly do some a small number of PowerPoints and run through it next week.
And Susan is an electronic person. I'm a paper person. Would it help you if we copied it and mailed a hard copy? I no. But would you want a hard copy? You don't want to print out 53 pages.
It's easier for me to read a hard copy. I just looked at it and said it has to be shorter, or even if this were the final report and you want it to be read, it needs to be.
Is there anybody here who would like a hard copy?
If you're handing them out, it would make my life simpler.
Maybe Melissa can send you one.
Next time you're in the building, which is probably tomorrow.
Right.
Tomorrow I will be in the building.
Okay. Melissa, do you have the document?
No, I don't.
Okay.
You're going to tell us tomorrow what they
Right. Okay.
Otherwise, the other pieces are revenue and fiscal policies. Well, demographics got a pass because they got their tiger team and they got a pass because they're going to come up with the holy grail answer at the end. So the good news is that they got a pass for next week. The bad news is they have to have the perfect answer when they do report out. So no pressure.
I'll speak in Michael's absence. It has several meetings scheduled, which I think is where we're
going to do some of the
sifting it down. I think we're finished with the inputs, some stats here and there, but.
Okay, and pension and benefits you wanted until next week anyway.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to get to the written report.
Okay.
I keep getting other things, but if I have the written report next week, my question is, what am I doing? We've all heard the presentation. There's nothing new other than addition of background materials.
Okay.
Which I was hoping to get to, which I missed my own deadline for today, to the rest of the committee and to Sean to take a look at.
Okay.
But I'm hoping for next Wednesday, my granddaughter gets healthy and I don't have to babysit. Then it would, be. I was going to ask, what do I do with it next? I guess send it to Melissa and she can post it, or I don't know that it needs a vote because they're just.
We have until the close of business on Monday to set the agenda. So as your task force works through, Beth is away, but
she's not here
Just
now.
real quick, so there won't be we will not have a programs task force meeting next Wednesday because I know we won't be here, so that we can't have a quorum. So you could start earlier if you wanted to. Unless someone else is using that time, we won't be meeting.
You won't be here at all next Wednesday, or you won't be here at 6?
I won't be here at all.
Okay.
That makes it hard to hear from their part of the schools.
Right.
Beth and Jim can report out. We just met.
So we need to make sure Beth and Jim are going to be here next Wednesday.
Yeah, we feel that they weren't. They knew.
All right, good. So Cliff will solve all this and tell us. Thank you. So exciting.
Susan,
Cliff, you're responsible for making this work.
Yeah, exactly. Let us know how it goes. Yes,
I
please.
just emailed my paper to Melissa. Do you want her to post it or just for the purpose of making copies? I don't know. I mean,
I think the only person, did anybody want a hard copy besides Janet?
I just
And-
want a hard copy of Cliff's.
Oh.
It's actually probably easier to read than to hard copy, just one.
Okay.
I think let's not post it until it becomes a.
It was 57 pages.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
But
it's still a draft.
it is still a draft.
Still a draft.
It is not a public document until it's used at a meeting.
It's been used in meetings.
No, it's just been.
No, it's just draft.
It's what we
Lee's?
talked about.
No,
Oh,
Lee's,
Cliff's.
yeah, and
Lee's has been distributed. I don't know if Cliff
Lee's.
has.
No, not the paper, just the
no, he's
spreadsheets.
been working on a draft.
I think it's gone to the full. Anyway, I don't know.
Okay. All right, good.
Okay.
Can I defend my revenue thing?
Which is what? If it involves trying to wiggle out of next Wednesday, no.
No,
We're
well,
adjourning.
actually-
I'm just resource constrained because
Okay.
today I got assigned a section on municipal.
Okay.
So it's either I drop, like I just can't do
Okay.
everything. And with respect to revenue, I would present the same jokes, the same PowerPoint.
No, don't do the exact same
Okay.
thing.
So
And-
then I don't think we're ready to present. I could distribute a Word document and be up in 2 Wednesdays, and I don't have a problem signing up for that.
Great.
I just don't think I can do it next week.
Alberto also has been the point of contact with the MIT Sloan School students for the demographic subcommittee. So,
You're a good man, Charlie Brown. All right.
good.
All right, so then here's what I would like to ask. Let me ask it this way. If each of the subcommittee chairs can email us by Friday and let us know where you are, that would be very, very helpful. And then Dick and I will go from there.
Yeah. Or
okay?
and frankly, I would say until Monday because we can. I know.
We just have these like last minute fire drills. Oh, that's a good question.
I assume we can meet at 6, right?
If-
But
If you guys
well-
aren't,
We're not.
you're not.
what about Cliff? Will your school task force want to meet prior to our meeting on Wednesday? Let us know. Okay.
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 That would be.
All right, so we'll
Okay.
setting the time.
Okay.
Okay. Yep.
All right. Thank you. We're adjourned.